My name is Lydia Harper. I'm 36 years old, and for most of my adult life, people have described me with the same handful of words: reliable, calm, reasonable. Sometimes they meant it as a compliment. Other times, I'm not so sure. I live in Portland, Oregon, and I work as a financial compliance analyst. My job is simple to explain but complicated to do. I look for patterns most people miss: small discrepancies, quiet shifts in numbers, tiny decisions that eventually reveal a much larger truth. Ironically, the same thing happened in my own life. If you had met me a few years ago, you probably would have thought I had things figured out. I was married to a man I had known since my late 20s. We both had stable jobs. We had a shared savings account that represented something important: the future we were building together. For 3 years, we saved for our first home. Not extravagantly, not dramatically. Just the quiet, consistent kind of saving that happens when two people believe they're working toward the same dream. We skipped vacations. We drove older cars. We learned how to cook at home more often than we ate out. And slowly, month by month, the number in that account grew. I believed that number represented trust. But one afternoon, while reviewing our finances, something I did routinely, I noticed something that didn't make sense. The balance was wrong. Not slightly wrong. Half of it was gone. At first, I assumed there had been a mistake, a banking error, a transfer I had forgotten about, something explainable. But when I followed the trail of transactions, I discovered the truth. The money hadn't been stolen by a stranger. It had been given away. My husband had transferred half of our house down payment to someone else, and the person who received it was his sister. He didn't ask me. He didn't tell me. He didn't even mention that anything had changed. Now, this story isn't about screaming matches or dramatic revenge. There wasn't a moment when I threw things across a room or demanded answers in the middle of the night. What happened instead was quieter than that, and in some ways, much more permanent. Because the moment I realized what had happened, I didn't explode. I simply started paying attention. What followed wasn't a fight. It was a shift, one decision at a time, that changed my marriage, my future, and the way I understood the word partnership. So before we go any further, I'm curious about something. Have you ever discovered something about someone you trusted that made you quietly see them in a completely different light? If you asked the people in my husband's family to describe me back then, their answers would have sounded almost identical. Lydia is so organized. She's very practical. She's the kind of person you can depend on. Those things were true, but there was always a subtle tone underneath those compliments. Something gentle, almost invisible, but very real. Dependable people, I learned, are often treated like infrastructure. Necessary, useful, always there, but rarely questioned about what they want. My husband, Ethan, used to say he admired that about me. He liked that I didn't create drama. I preferred solving problems quietly instead of arguing about them. At the time, I thought that meant we respected each other. Now I understand something different. He respected what my calm made easier for everyone else. Ethan was charming in the way people find effortless. He worked in commercial real estate, which meant he spent most days talking, persuading, and negotiating. People naturally gravitated toward him. He could walk into a room full of strangers and leave with 3 new contacts and a dinner invitation. Next to that kind of energy, my quietness looked even quieter. But it didn't bother me. I never needed to be the loudest person in a room. I've always been more comfortable observing than performing. And in Ethan's family, observation turned out to be very useful. His sister Rachel was 2 years younger than he and almost the opposite of me in every visible way. Where I planned, she improvised. Where I analyzed, she reacted. Rachel had a way of moving through life with confidence that didn't require preparation. If she wanted something, she assumed the world would rearrange itself to help her get it. And often, it did. When Ethan and I first started dating, I tried to understand that dynamic without judging it. Families develop their own rhythms over decades. Outsiders rarely see the full story. Rachel lived about 20 minutes away from us. She worked different jobs over the years: marketing assistant, event coordinator, social media manager. But stability never seemed to interest her very much. Whenever things didn't work out somewhere, she would simply pivot. Their parents often described her as free-spirited, which sounded nicer than the thought that sometimes crossed my mind. No one had ever expected her to carry much responsibility. But again, I never said that out loud. I didn't see conflict as useful unless it solved something. At family dinners, the pattern was always the same. Rachel would talk about her latest idea or problem. Ethan would listen carefully, sometimes offering suggestions, sometimes quietly offering help. And I would sit nearby, occasionally answering practical questions. Questions like, "Lydia, do you know how mortgage pre-approval works again? Lydia, what's the difference between fixed and adjustable rates? Lydia, how long do most people save for a down payment? Those questions made sense. After all, Ethan and I had been saving for a house for 3 years. It had become almost a small identity inside the family. The responsible couple. The ones who had a plan. I didn't mind that reputation. In fact, I was proud of it. Saving that money wasn't easy. It meant turning down things other people our age were doing without thinking. But every time the topic came up, I noticed something. People congratulated Ethan. "Man, you're really setting things up for the future. You're going to be a homeowner before 40. That's impressive." And Ethan would smile, sometimes glancing at me briefly. But the conversation always moved forward as if the savings account belonged mostly to him. I told myself it didn't matter. Partnerships don't need public recognition to be real. At least, that's what I believed then. What I didn't realize was that, in their eyes, I had already been assigned a role. Not the decision maker, not an equal partner, just the reliable person standing quietly beside the plan. And once a role like that becomes comfortable for everyone else, it can take a very long time before anyone notices when it changes. The first moment that unsettled me didn't feel important at the time. In fact, if you had asked me that evening whether anything was wrong, I probably would have said no. It happened during a Sunday dinner at Ethan's parents' house. The kind of dinner they hosted almost every other week. Nothing fancy. Roast chicken, salad, and long conversations around a wooden table that had probably been in that kitchen for 20 years. Rachel arrived late, as usual. She swept into the room with the same restless energy she always carried, dropping her bag onto a chair and immediately launching into a story about a new apartment she was considering. "It's actually perfect," she said, pushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "But the landlord wants first month, last month, and a security deposit all at once." Ethan looked up from his plate. "How much are we talking about?" Rachel shrugged. "About 8,000 total." There was a brief silence at the table. Not uncomfortable. Just the kind that appears when people are mentally calculating numbers. Their mother sighed sympathetically. "That's a lot all at once." Rachel nodded dramatically. "Exactly. I can afford the rent long term, but the upfront part is ridiculous." Then she laughed lightly. "I swear, sometimes I wish I had one of those giant savings accounts like you two." She gestured casually toward Ethan and me. The comment didn't bother me. People referenced our house fund often. It had become a small family talking point. But then Ethan said something that made me pause. "Well, technically we do." His tone was playful, but the sentence lingered in the air longer than expected. Rachel raised an eyebrow. "Wait, seriously? How much do you guys have now?" I remember glancing at Ethan for a split second. Money details were something we usually kept private. Not secret, just personal. Ethan hesitated, then gave a loose answer. Enough for a decent down payment. Rachel leaned forward immediately. Okay, but hypothetically, she said, smiling in that persuasive way she had. If someone needed a little help with something temporary. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Their parents stayed quiet, not encouraging the idea, but not discouraging it either. It was one of those moments where a suggestion floats around the room without officially landing anywhere. I watched Ethan. He chuckled softly. Relax, he said. Lydia would run a full financial audit before we loaned anyone money. Everyone laughed, including me. But something about the way he said it stayed with me later that night. Not because of the joke itself, but because of the assumption inside it. He had framed the idea as if he would decide whether help happened, and I would simply analyze the logistics afterward. As if the money we saved together was something I managed, not something I had equal authority over. Again, it was a small thing, so small that confronting it would have felt unnecessary. And that's exactly why moments like that are easy to dismiss. Later, when Ethan and I drove home, Rachel's apartment situation never came up again. We talked about traffic, about work the next day, about a show we had been watching. The conversation moved forward as if nothing had happened. But quietly, somewhere in the back of my mind, I filed the moment away. Not as a problem, just as an observation. Because sometimes the first sign of a larger story isn't an argument. It's simply a sentence that reveals how someone already sees the situation. And once you hear it, you can't quite unhear it. After that dinner, life continued exactly the way it always had. Work during the week, grocery shopping on Thursdays, occasional dinners with Ethan's family, quiet weekends where we talked about neighborhoods we liked and houses we might eventually buy. On the surface, nothing had changed, but small things rarely announce themselves when they first appear. They repeat, and repetition is how they become normal. A few weeks after Rachel's apartment conversation, Ethan mentioned her again while we were cleaning up after dinner at home. She's still looking for a place, he said casually, rinsing a plate. The one she wanted fell through. I nodded. That happens a lot in this market. He dried his hands on a towel and leaned against the counter. She's thinking about moving closer to downtown. That would probably make commuting easier, I said. It was a normal conversation. Practical. Calm. But then Ethan added something else. She just needs a little breathing room financially. I remember pausing for a moment while stacking dishes. Not because of the words themselves, but because of the tone. The tone people use when they're building toward a suggestion without saying it yet. What kind of breathing room? I asked. Ethan shrugged. Just stability for a few months. Deposits, moving costs, stuff like that. I nodded slowly. Moving is expensive. He watched me for a moment, almost as if he expected something more from my reaction. When nothing came, he gave a small smile and changed the subject. At the time, I told myself the conversation had been harmless. Families help each other sometimes. That's normal. What I didn't realize yet was that the discussion itself wasn't the real issue. It was the pattern forming underneath it. Because from that point forward, Rachel's financial situation started appearing in conversations more frequently. Not urgently, just casually. A mention during a phone call, a comment at dinner, a quick update about how difficult the housing market was for renters. Each time, the subject floated near our savings without quite touching them. And every time, Ethan framed it in a similar way. She just needs a little help. It wouldn't be permanent. It's family. None of those statements was wrong, but there was something missing from them. Something that quietly shifted the balance of the conversation. He never said, our decision. He said things like, I've been thinking about what we could do. Or, if I helped her out a little. The first few times I heard those phrases, I corrected them gently. We, I would say. If we helped. Ethan always nodded. Right. Of course. But then, a few days later, the language would slip again. At first, I assumed it was just a habit. People grow up with certain family roles. Ethan had always been the older brother who stepped in when Rachel struggled. Maybe he wasn't used to seeing that responsibility as something shared with a spouse. So I rationalized it. I told myself that marriage meant adjusting expectations, not scrutinizing every sentence. Still, something about those conversations left a quiet weight in my mind. Not anger, not even frustration. Just a growing awareness that somewhere in the background, an assumption existed. An assumption that Rachel's needs were flexible priorities, and that the money Ethan and I had saved together might also be flexible. I didn't challenge that assumption directly. Not yet. Because at that stage, it still felt hypothetical. Just conversations. Just possibilities. And when something only exists as a possibility, it's easy to convince yourself that addressing it would create a problem that doesn't actually exist. So I stayed calm. I stayed reasonable. I stayed quiet. And without realizing it, that silence helped something else happen. It allowed everyone around me to believe that the role they had quietly assigned to me was one I was perfectly comfortable playing. There's a moment in many relationships when you realize something subtle, but important. Not what people say about you, but what they expect from you without asking. For me, that realization came during a small conversation that almost felt too ordinary to matter. It was a Saturday afternoon, and Ethan and I were sitting at our kitchen table reviewing mortgage estimates. I had opened 3 different lender spreadsheets on my laptop: interest rates, closing costs, and projected monthly payments. This kind of planning was something I genuinely enjoyed. Numbers tell stories if you're patient enough to listen. Ethan leaned back in his chair, watching me scroll through columns. "You're incredible at this stuff," he said. I smiled slightly. "It's literally my job." "No, I mean it," he continued. "I'd be completely lost without you managing all of this." The comment sounded kind, and in many ways it was. But the word he used stayed with me. Managing. Not deciding. Not building. Managing. I closed one spreadsheet and looked at him. "You're not lost," I said. "You just don't like spreadsheets." He laughed. "That's true." Then he added something else. "That's why we work so well. I handle the big picture opportunities, and you keep everything organized." The sentence landed gently, but it carried an assumption that suddenly felt very clear. In his mind, we had divided responsibilities in a specific way. Ethan made moves. I made sure those moves were practical. It was a comfortable structure, efficient. And for a long time, I had participated in it without questioning the deeper implications. Being the organized one can feel powerful in its own way. You understand the system. You see the details others miss. But there's also a quiet risk inside that role. If you're always the person who manages logistics, people can start believing you exist mainly to support decisions, not to shape them. A week later, that realization became even clearer during another dinner with Ethan's family. Rachel had found a new apartment she loved. "Seriously, it's perfect," she said excitedly. "Great neighborhood, close to my office, tons of natural light." "That sounds nice," I said. "The only issue is the upfront cost again," she added quickly. "But once I'm settled, everything will be fine." Ethan nodded sympathetically. "You've had a rough streak lately." Rachel shrugged dramatically. "Life happens." Their parents exchanged glances, the same quiet mixture of concern and patience they always showed her. Then Rachel looked directly at Ethan. "You know what I wish?" she said lightly. "What?" "That I had someone in my life who understood finances the way Lydia does." She smiled at me. It sounded like a compliment, but the next sentence revealed something else. You're so lucky to have her keeping everything organized. Again, everyone laughed softly. And again, the framing was familiar. Not Lydia, the equal partner. Not Lydia, the person whose choices carried weight. Just Lydia, the calm, competent person who made other people's plans work smoothly. That night, driving home, I thought about the pattern more carefully than I ever had before. It wasn't hostility. No one was trying to diminish me. But a role had quietly formed around me. Reliable, useful, stable, and almost invisible when decisions were imagined. For the first time, I wondered something I had never asked myself before. If a real decision ever tested that assumption, would anyone in that room actually expect my answer to matter? The moment everything changed didn't happen during an argument. There wasn't a dramatic conversation or a sudden betrayal that instantly revealed the truth. Instead, it happened on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. I was at home, working remotely, reviewing a compliance report that required cross-checking several financial records. It was the kind of task that demanded focus. Scanning numbers, verifying transfers, making sure nothing small had slipped through unnoticed. Halfway through the afternoon, I decided to check our shared savings account. Not because I suspected anything, just because I did that sometimes. When you work with financial systems all day, reviewing your own accounts becomes almost automatic. At first, nothing seemed unusual. The account balance appeared on the screen, the same familiar layout I had seen dozens of times before. But after a few seconds, something in my mind didn't line up. The number felt wrong. Not dramatically wrong, just slightly off. The kind of feeling you get when a puzzle piece is placed in the correct shape, but the picture doesn't quite match. So I opened the transaction history. There were the usual entries: paycheck deposits, monthly transfers from our checking account, a few small automatic payments. Then I saw the transfer. It was a single line, a large one. $48,000. Outgoing transfer. For a moment, I assumed it had to be something administrative. Maybe a temporary hold related to the mortgage pre-approval process we had been exploring. But when I opened the details, the destination account appeared, and the name attached to it was immediately recognizable. Rachel Bennett, Ethan's sister. I stared at the screen for a long time, not because I didn't understand what the numbers meant, but because my mind needed a moment to catch up with the implication. $48,000. Almost half of the money we had saved for our house. Transferred 3 days earlier. I checked the rest of the account history. No notes, no explanation, no message from Ethan mentioning anything about it. Just the transaction itself. Clean. Final. The first emotion I expected to feel was anger. But that's not what arrived. Instead, what I felt was something quieter. A kind of stillness. When you work with financial investigations, there's a moment after discovering an irregularity where you don't react emotionally yet. You simply gather information. So that's what I did. I opened the banking logs, verified the transfer authorization, checked the timestamp. It had been initiated from Ethan's login. Late at night, 11:43 p.m. 3 nights ago. Which meant something else became immediately clear. He had gone to bed next to me that night, had a normal breakfast with me the next morning, talked casually about work, and at no point had he mentioned moving half of our future into someone else's account. I leaned back in my chair and closed my laptop slowly. Not out of frustration, out of clarity. Because in that moment, something inside me shifted in a way I can still describe very precisely. Up until that afternoon, I had believed the quiet assumptions around me were mostly harmless, that people simply misunderstood my role, that if a real decision ever came up, of course, Ethan would treat me like an equal partner. But the transaction sitting in that account history proved something else. The decision had already happened. And in Ethan's mind, it hadn't required my involvement at all. I didn't confront him immediately. I didn't call Rachel. I didn't send messages or demand explanations. Instead, I did something much simpler. I opened the small leather notebook I kept beside my desk, and I wrote down the transaction details, the date, the amount, the account number. Not because I planned to start a fight, but because when a moment like that arrives, you realize something important. The story you thought you were living in may not be the real one. And once you see that clearly, the next step isn't anger. It's attention. That evening, Ethan came home at the usual time, around 6:30. I heard his keys in the hallway, the familiar sound of the front door opening, and his footsteps moving toward the kitchen. Everything about the moment felt completely ordinary. "Hey," he called out. "Hi," I replied from the living room. He walked in, loosening his tie slightly, the way he always did after work. "Traffic was terrible today," he said. I nodded. "It's getting worse lately." We talked about dinner for a few minutes. Nothing important, just the quiet domestic logistics that fill most evenings in a long relationship. At one point, Ethan opened the refrigerator and glanced over his shoulder. "Did you want to order something tonight?" "Sure," I said calmly. "Thai, maybe." "Perfect." Amantain. If someone had walked into the apartment at that moment, they would have seen a completely normal couple. No tension, no raised voices, no visible cracks. And that was exactly the point. Because the silence between us that evening wasn't accidental. It was intentional. I had already decided something important earlier that afternoon. Confrontation, at that moment, would only produce explanations. And explanations, when someone has already acted without asking you, are often designed to make the decision sound reasonable after the fact. I wasn't interested in hearing a version of the story shaped to calm me down. I was interested in understanding the reality behind it. So instead of confronting Ethan, I did something else. I observed. During dinner, he talked about a potential deal at work, a commercial property his firm was evaluating. He described it with the same enthusiasm he always used when discussing opportunities. His tone was relaxed, unconcerned. There was no hint of guilt or hesitation when he spoke. At one point, he asked, "How was your day?" "Pretty normal," I said. And that answer was technically true, because discovering the transfer had already changed something fundamental. But the change wasn't visible yet. After dinner, we watched an episode of a show we'd been following. Ethan laughed at one of the characters' jokes. The sound filled the room naturally, comfortably. Again, nothing in his behavior suggested that he believed anything unusual had happened, which meant one thing became very clear. From his perspective, the decision to move that money didn't require discussion. He saw it as something within his authority, and perhaps even something I would simply accept once he eventually mentioned it. Later that night, after Ethan had fallen asleep, I got out of bed quietly and walked into the living room. The city outside our window was dim and quiet. I opened my laptop again, not to recheck the transaction. I already knew what it showed. Instead, I started reviewing other things. Our savings structure, the legal ownership of the account, the mortgage pre-approval documents we had started preparing. I wasn't angry. Anger is loud. What I felt was more focused than that. Clarity tends to remove emotional noise. And clarity had revealed something simple. For 3 years, I had believed Ethan and I were building something together. But the moment he transferred that money without telling me, he quietly redefined the structure of our partnership. He made a unilateral decision about something we had created jointly. And once someone shows you the real boundaries of your influence in their life, you have 2 choices. You can argue about those boundaries, or you can start deciding what they mean for your future decisions. That night, sitting alone in the soft glow of the laptop screen, I made a quiet commitment to myself. I wouldn't rush. I wouldn't react emotionally. And I definitely wouldn't reveal how much I had already noticed. Because sometimes silence is mistaken for weakness. But in the right moment, silence can also be preparation. In the days after discovering the transfer, my life outwardly continued exactly the same. I went to work, I cooked dinner, I asked Ethan how his meetings went. From the outside, nothing had changed. And that was precisely why no one noticed what was happening beneath the surface. People often assume preparation looks dramatic, like secret phone calls or tense conversations behind closed doors. In reality, preparation is usually quiet. It looks like research, documentation, observation. The first thing I did was something that felt almost instinctive to me. I mapped the financial structure of our life. Not emotionally, just factually. The savings account where the transfer happened had been opened 3 years earlier, when we first committed to saving for a home. Both of our names were on it. Technically, either of us could initiate a transfer without the other's approval. That part wasn't surprising. What mattered more was understanding the larger system around that account. So I reviewed everything. Our joint checking account, our individual retirement funds, the mortgage pre-approval paperwork we had started months earlier. I wasn't looking for mistakes. I was looking for clarity, and clarity revealed something interesting. While most of our daily finances were shared, a significant portion of our assets were still structured individually, especially long-term investments and credit histories, which meant something important. Our financial lives were connected, but not inseparable. The second thing I did was review our home purchase timeline. For 3 years, Ethan and I had been treating the down payment fund as the final step before buying a house. But now half of it was gone, which meant the timeline had quietly shifted. I recalculated what rebuilding those savings would actually take. At our previous pace, it would require another 2 to 3 years. 3 more years of postponing plans. 3 more years of assuming our priorities were aligned. That realization didn't make me angry. It simply made something clearer. Ethan had made a decision that reshaped our shared future, and he had done it without even informing me. The third thing I did was start documenting, not obsessively, just carefully. Every financial record is connected to the transfer. Bank confirmations, transaction timestamps, account ownership details. The same way I would approach a compliance case at work, because experience had taught me something important. Memories are emotional. Records are factual. And when situations become complicated later, the difference between those two things can matter more than people expect. Meanwhile, Ethan continued behaving exactly the same way he always had, which meant one possibility became increasingly obvious. He still hadn't planned to tell me. Or if he had, he assumed the conversation could happen casually. One evening while we were cooking, he mentioned Rachel again. "She finally signed a lease," he said while chopping vegetables. "That's good," I replied. "She's really excited about the place." I nodded. "Sounds like it worked out." He smiled slightly. "Yeah, she just needed a little push." The sentence lingered for a moment, but Ethan said nothing else. No explanation, no mention of money, just the same relaxed tone as always. That was the moment I understood something with complete certainty. He believed the decision was normal, not something that required negotiation, not something that might fundamentally change the trust between us. Just something he had done. And the more I observed that assumption, the more another realization formed quietly in my mind. For years, everyone around me had treated my calmness as proof that I would always adjust. I would analyze situations, make them practical, and keep things running smoothly. And maybe that had been true. Until now. Because preparation doesn't always mean preparing to argue. Sometimes preparation means repositioning yourself before anyone realizes the situation has changed. And while Ethan and Rachel were both moving forward with their lives as if nothing unusual had happened, I had already started adjusting the way I understood mine. They simply hadn't noticed yet. The realization that changed everything didn't arrive suddenly. It unfolded slowly over the course of a week. By that point, I had already reviewed most of our financial records and reorganized the information in my notebook. I understood the structure of our accounts better than ever before. But one evening, while reviewing a set of mortgage documents we had started months earlier, something else caught my attention. It was a detail so small that most people would probably overlook it. But small details are exactly what my job trains me to notice. When Ethan and I first began the mortgage pre-approval process, the lender had asked us a standard question. How would the property title be structured? Joint ownership can be arranged in several ways, and lenders always ask early so the paperwork aligns with legal ownership later. At the time, Ethan had answered quickly. Joint tenants, he had said, which meant equal ownership. Simple, fair, and exactly what I expected in a marriage. But now that I was reviewing the documents again, I noticed something else. In the application notes, the lender had included a second comment, a routine clarification. It explained that only the down payment funds needed to be verified as joint assets. The rest of the mortgage qualification would rely primarily on credit history and income ratios. That detail alone wasn't unusual, but it triggered a different line of thinking in my mind. Because while Ethan and I had built the down payment together, our credit profiles and professional financial histories were very different. My work in financial compliance has given me something valuable over the years. Extremely strong credit, stable income documentation, and several long-standing investment accounts that Ethan wasn't connected to. For the first time since discovering the transfer, I asked myself a question I hadn't considered before. What if the path to buying a home didn't actually require the structure Ethan and I had been planning? So the next day, during my lunch break, I called the mortgage advisor we had spoken with previously. Not to restart the application, just to ask a hypothetical question. If someone were applying individually, I said carefully, what would lenders typically look for? The advisor answered easily. Income stability, debt-to-income ratio, credit history, standard evaluation factors. Nothing surprising. But then he asked something practical. Are you thinking about purchasing on your own timeline instead of jointly? I paused for a moment before responding. I'm just exploring possibilities. That was technically true, because until that conversation, I had still been viewing Ethan's decision as something that disrupted our plan. But the more the advisor explained the process, the more another realization settled quietly into place. Ethan's transfer hadn't just moved money. It had revealed something deeper. He had already acted independently when it came to our future, which meant there was no rule saying I had to keep framing my decisions around the same shared structure. By the time the call ended, I understood something clearly. With my income and credit profile, qualifying for a mortgage independently wasn't just possible. It was very realistic. I closed my laptop and sat quietly for a moment. There was no excitement, no sudden rush of relief, just a calm understanding that the situation in front of me contained more options than I had originally believed. For 3 years, Ethan and I had been working toward one version of the future, but the moment he moved that money without telling me, he had quietly stepped outside that shared agreement. And once someone does that, you're no longer obligated to pretend the original structure still exists. That evening, when Ethan came home, he greeted me the same way he always did, relaxed, comfortable, completely unaware that something fundamental had changed. Not between us, but inside my understanding of what came next. Because that afternoon, sitting alone at my desk, I had discovered something that gave me complete clarity. Not leverage in the dramatic sense, just independence. And once you realize you have that, the entire story begins to look different. After the conversation with the mortgage advisor, I didn't rush into anything. That would have been out of character for me. Instead, I spent the next several days doing what I always do when faced with an important decision. I examined the options carefully, because once I understood that buying a home independently was possible, The situation in front of me split into several very clear paths. The first option was the most obvious one. Confront Ethan immediately. Ask him why he transferred the money. Demand that he reverse the decision. Insist that our original plans still mattered. There was a certain emotional satisfaction in imagining that conversation. But when I looked at it logically, it had a problem. Even if Ethan apologized, even if Rachel somehow returned the money, the underlying issue would still remain. He had already shown that when it came to a decision about our shared future, he felt comfortable acting alone. You can negotiate behavior, but you can't easily renegotiate instinct. The second option was more passive. I could simply accept what had happened. Treat the transfer as a temporary family loan. Wait patiently for the money to return. Continue rebuilding the down payment together. That option required the least disruption, but it also required something else. It required trusting that the same person who made a unilateral decision once wouldn't do it again. And the more I thought about that possibility, the less realistic it felt, which left the third option. Not confrontation, not passive acceptance, but restructuring my future quietly. At first, the idea sounded almost too simple. If Ethan had already acted independently with our shared savings, then I could begin preparing my own plans independently as well. No deception, no retaliation, just a shift in the assumptions guiding my decisions. The more I thought about it, the clearer that option became. Because something important had changed the moment I discovered the transfer. The partnership Ethan believed we had was no longer the one I believed in, and pretending otherwise wouldn't repair that difference. One evening that week, Ethan and I were sitting on the couch reviewing real estate listings, something we had done dozens of times before. He scrolled through photos of kitchens and living rooms on his tablet. "This one's interesting," he said. "The neighborhood's getting popular." I leaned forward and looked at the listing. Nice house, reasonable price. Exactly the kind of place we had been imagining for months. "Yeah," I said quietly. "It's a good one." Ethan smiled. "Imagine having a place like that by next year." I watched the images for a moment. The bright windows. The empty living room is waiting for furniture. A life we had once been planning together. And in that moment, the decision finally settled into place. Not dramatically, just clearly. I wouldn't confront Ethan yet. I wouldn't reveal what I had discovered. Instead, I would begin preparing something new. Carefully, quietly. And by the time the truth eventually surfaced, because eventually it always does, the structure of my life would already be positioned somewhere very different. Not as a reaction, but as a choice. Later that night, after Ethan went to sleep, I opened my notebook again. On a new page, I wrote 3 words. Independent purchase timeline. Then, underneath it, I began outlining the steps. Once the decision was made, everything became very simple. Not easy, but simple. Because preparation doesn't require emotional energy once the direction is clear. It only requires consistency. The first step was separating my financial structure more carefully. Ethan and I already had individual accounts alongside our joint ones, which meant I didn't need to create anything new. I simply adjusted the way my income moved. Instead of transferring extra funds into the shared savings account the way I had for the past 3 years, I redirected that surplus into my personal investment account. The change was subtle, not dramatic enough to raise questions. After all, the joint savings had already lost nearly half its balance. Adding more money immediately would have only rebuilt a structure that Ethan had already treated as flexible. The second step was credit preparation. Although my credit history was strong, lenders still evaluate several details during a mortgage application: debt ratios, documentation history, and long-term account stability. So I reviewed everything carefully. I paid off a small remaining balance on one credit card. I updated income verification documents. I reorganized my financial records in a way that would make future underwriting smoother. These were the kinds of adjustments most people only make after they decide to apply for a mortgage. But preparation works better when it happens earlier. Meanwhile, life inside the apartment continued the same way it always had. Ethan talked about work. We cooked dinner together. We occasionally browsed housing listings online. And still, he never mentioned the transfer. Not once. Rachel's name came up occasionally in conversation. She loves the new apartment, Ethan said one evening while scrolling through his phone. That's good, I replied. She finally feels settled. I nodded. Moving can be stressful. Again, no mention of money. No explanation. Just the same calm assumption that everything in our lives was still operating on the same shared understanding. But by that point, I was already moving forward with the third step. Quiet consultations. During a lunch break one afternoon, I met with the mortgage advisor in person. Nothing official yet, just information. We reviewed my financial profile, discussed approximate price ranges, and looked at potential timelines for a solo purchase. The advisor was straightforward. With your credit history and income stability, he said, qualifying independently shouldn't be difficult. Mal, he asked one practical question near the end of the meeting. Is this something you're planning to move on to soon? I considered the question carefully. Soon, I said, which again was true. Because while Ethan still believed our future plan had only been delayed, I had already started building something different. The final step was something Ethan would never have noticed. Observation. Not of finances, of behavior. Over the next 2 weeks, I paid closer attention to how Ethan talked about the future. What surprised me most wasn't what he said. It was what he didn't say. He never mentioned returning the money to our savings. He never described the transfer as temporary. He never even hinted that the decision might have affected our timeline. In his mind, the situation had already resolved itself. Rachel needed help. He helped her. End of story. And perhaps he believed that eventually, when he told me about it, I would analyze the situation the same way I always had. Calmly. Practically. Helping the decision make sense. What he didn't realize was that while he had been living comfortably inside that assumption, I had already stepped outside it, quietly, methodically. And by the time anyone noticed, most of the important work would already be finished. Consequences rarely arrive all at once. Most of the time, they appear gradually. Small shifts that feel confusing at first because no one can immediately identify the cause. About a month after I discovered the transfer, the first shift appeared. It happened during one of our usual Sunday dinners at Ethan's parents' house. Rachel had invited everyone over to see her new apartment. The place was exactly the way she had described it. Bright windows, newly painted walls, a small balcony overlooking the street. She gave us a full tour with obvious pride. I told you it was perfect, she said, opening the balcony door. Ethan smiled. You did well. Their parents complimented the layout and asked questions about the neighborhood. I walked through the apartment quietly, noticing details the way I always did. The quality of the building, the furnishings Rachel had chosen, the subtle signs of how quickly she had settled into the space. Everything looked comfortable, stable. After the tour, we all gathered in the living room with drinks while Rachel talked about decorating ideas. At one point, she glanced at Ethan with a warm smile. I seriously don't know what I would have done without you. The sentence slipped out naturally. No hesitation, no concern about how it might sound. Their parents looked mildly curious. What do you mean? Their mother asked. Rachel waved a hand casually. Oh, just the whole moving situation. Ethan helped me get everything lined up. Ethan gave a quick nod and took a sip of his drink. Again, nothing dramatic. Just a quiet confirmation. For the first time, I watched the interaction from a different perspective. Rachel believed Ethan had simply done what older brothers often do: help when things get difficult. Ethan believed he had solved a family problem efficiently, and neither of them appeared to think the situation required any deeper explanation. The conversation moved on quickly. But later that evening, while we were driving home, something interesting happened. Ethan mentioned a real estate listing we had looked at the week before. "You know," he said, "with the market moving the way it is, we might want to slow down a bit on the house search." I kept my voice calm. "What do you mean?" "Just take a little more time saving," he replied. "No need to rush into anything." I looked out the car window for a moment. Streetlights passing by. Quiet neighborhoods sliding past in the dark. The sentence had revealed exactly what I expected. In Ethan's mind, the delay was simply a timeline adjustment, not a decision that required discussion, not something that fundamentally changed our shared plan. Just a practical shift. "Maybe another couple of years," he added casually. 2 years. Almost exactly the number I had calculated when reviewing the savings account after the transfer. I nodded slowly. That could make sense. He seemed relieved by the calm response. "Yeah, no pressure." The rest of the drive home was quiet, but the consequences of his earlier decision had already started unfolding, even if he didn't recognize them yet. Because while Ethan believed our future had simply been postponed, he didn't realize something else had already changed. The person sitting beside him in the car was no longer planning that future the same way. And the longer he assumed everything was still aligned, the further apart our realities were, quietly drifting. 2 weeks later, the situation finally surfaced. Not because I brought it up, and not because Ethan suddenly decided to explain. It happened because of something much more ordinary: paperwork. By that point, my independent mortgage pre-qualification had already been approved. I hadn't told anyone yet. Not Ethan, not my friends, not even my parents. There was no need. I was still in the research stage, visiting properties quietly during lunch breaks, or on occasional afternoons when my schedule allowed it. But lenders always require documentation updates as you move forward. And one afternoon, while Ethan was working from home, a notification appeared on our shared email account. It was from the bank that held our joint savings. The subject line was routine: account activity confirmation. Ethan must have opened it immediately, because a few seconds later, I heard his voice from the living room. "Hey, Lydia?" His tone wasn't alarmed, just puzzled. I walked out of my office calmly. "What's up?" He turned the laptop toward me. "Did you move money out of the joint savings?" The screen showed the most recent transfer, a modest one compared to the original $48,000 he had moved. But this time, the transfer had gone in the opposite direction, from the joint account into my personal account, part of the remaining balance that I had contributed over the years. Nothing illegal, nothing hidden, just a reallocation of funds I had deposited. I looked at the screen briefly. "Yes," I said. Ethan frowned slightly. "Why?" The question hung in the air. Not confrontational, just confused. For a moment, I considered answering with another question, but instead, I chose something simpler. "I'm reorganizing some things financially." He leaned back in his chair, still trying to understand. "Reorganizing how?" The moment had finally arrived. Not dramatically, just inevitably. So I answered honestly. "I'm preparing to buy a house." Ethan blinked. "Well, yeah," he said slowly. "That's what we've been saving for." I shook my head slightly. "No. I mean, I'm preparing to buy one myself." The silence that followed was the first real pause I had heard from him in weeks. Not anger, not even disbelief. Just the quiet moment when someone realizes the situation in front of them is different from the one they assumed they were in. Ethan stared at me. "Wait, what?" I've been exploring a solo mortgage application, I explained calmly. It was approved. His expression shifted rapidly. Confusion first, then something closer to concern. Why would you do that? The question sounded sincere, which made the answer even simpler. Because our original plan changed. He shook his head slightly. What do you mean? For a moment, I watched him carefully, trying to determine whether he truly didn't understand, or whether he simply hadn't considered the connection. So I said the one thing that made the entire situation clear. The day you transferred $48,000 to Rachel without telling me. The color drained slightly from his face. You know about that? Yes. How long? About 6 weeks. Another silence. This one is heavier. Not explosive. Just filled with the realization that time had already moved forward in ways he hadn't noticed. Ethan ran a hand through his hair. Lydia, I was going to explain that. I nodded. I'm sure you were. And in that moment, something became painfully obvious to both of us. The conversation he thought he still had time to have was arriving far too late. The conversation that followed was quieter than most people would probably expect. There was no shouting, no accusations thrown across the room. Just two people standing in the living room, finally acknowledging a reality that had been quietly unfolding for weeks. Ethan sat down slowly on the couch, still processing what I had said. You knew about the transfer for 6 weeks? He asked. Yes. And you didn't say anything? No. He looked genuinely unsettled by that. I don't understand why you wouldn't just ask me about it. I sat in the chair across from him, because by the time I saw the transaction, the decision had already been made. He opened his mouth, then paused. That wasn't how it was supposed to happen, he said after a moment. I waited. Rachel was in a really tight situation, he continued. The landlord needed the deposit immediately, or she was going to lose the apartment. I understand, I said. And I knew you'd want to analyze everything first, he added. But there wasn't time for that. The explanation arrived exactly the way I had expected. Urgency. Family. A decision made quickly for someone else's benefit. Ethan leaned forward slightly. I wasn't trying to go behind your back. I nodded once. I know. That answer seemed to confuse him even more. If you know that, then why are you acting like this changes everything? The question was honest. From his perspective, he had solved a temporary problem. From mine, something else had happened. So I explained it simply. Because the money wasn't the real issue. He frowned. Then what is? The assumption behind the decision. I spoke calmly, the way I would explain a professional situation. For 3 years, we treated that savings account as something we were building together. When you transferred half of it without telling me, you made a decision about our shared future on your own. Ethan rubbed his forehead. I thought you'd understand why it was necessary. Maybe I would have, I said, if we had talked about it. The distinction hung quietly in the air. After a moment, he asked the question that had clearly been forming in his mind since the beginning of the conversation. So now you're just buying a house without me? Yes. His voice lowered. That feels extreme, Lydia. I considered that for a moment. Then I answered honestly. Not really. He looked at me, waiting for more. You made a major financial decision without consulting me. I continued. All I did was respond by planning my next decision independently as well. Ethan sat back again. The logic was simple, which made it difficult to argue with. After a long silence, he asked one final question. Why didn't you tell me earlier? I thought about that carefully, not because the answer was complicated, but I wanted to explain it clearly. Because once I saw the transfer, I said, I realized something important. What? that the partnership I thought we had wasn't the one you believed we had. The room fell quiet again, not tense, just filled with the weight of understanding that arrives when two people finally see the same situation from completely different angles. And in that moment, neither of us raised our voices, because the truth didn't require it. A few months have passed since that conversation, long enough for the initial shock to settle into something quieter, long enough for life to reorganize itself around a new reality. I did buy a house, not a huge one, not the kind of place that impresses people at dinner parties, but it's exactly what I wanted. A small, modern townhouse about 15 minutes outside the city. It has large windows, a quiet street, and a small office space where I can work without distractions. The day I signed the final documents, the process felt strangely calm. No dramatic sense of victory. No bitterness. Just a quiet awareness that I had built something for myself that rested entirely on my own decisions. Ethan and I are no longer living together. The separation didn't happen overnight. There were more conversations after that evening, practical ones about logistics, about what our relationship meant going forward. But the truth we had uncovered during that calm confrontation never really changed. He had believed that helping Rachel immediately was the obvious choice. I had believed that a shared future required shared decisions. Neither of those beliefs was wrong on its own. They were simply incompatible once the situation tested them. Rachel, as far as I know, is still living in the same apartment. I don't blame her for what happened. From her perspective, her brother stepped in to help during a difficult moment. She probably never imagined the ripple effects that decision would create in our marriage. And honestly, the story was never really about Rachel. It was about something much simpler. Understanding who you are inside a partnership and what happens when that understanding isn't mutual. For a long time, I believed my calmness meant compromise. That being reasonable meant smoothing over difficult moments and keeping everything balanced. But the experience taught me something different. Calmness doesn't have to mean accepting decisions that remove your voice. Sometimes calmness simply means choosing your response carefully instead of reacting emotionally. When people first hear my story, they often assume I must feel anger toward Ethan. But that isn't true. What I feel now is closer to clarity, because the situation forced me to see something I might otherwise have taken years to notice. Who I was in that relationship, and who I actually wanted to be. Today, when I sit in the living room of my own home, I sometimes think about the quiet moment when I first saw the missing money in our savings account. At the time, it looked like something had been taken away from me. Half of the future I thought we were building together. But now I see it differently. That moment didn't take anything away. It revealed something. And once you truly understand the structure of a situation, you can decide how to build the next one differently. Looking back now, I don't see that moment as the end of something. I see it as the moment I finally understood what kind of partnership I had been living in. For 3 years, Ethan and I saved money together for a house. I believed that account represented a shared plan. Two people building something side by side. But the day he gave half of our down payment to his sister without telling me, something important became clear. The issue was never just the money. It was the assumption that the decision didn't require my voice. And once I understood that, the path forward became surprisingly simple. I didn't argue. I didn't try to force him to undo what he had done. I just made sure the next decisions in my life reflected the kind of respect I believed a partnership should have. Sometimes people expect stories like this to end with revenge or dramatic justice. But real life rarely works that way. Most of the time, the most powerful response isn't loud. It's quite clear. It's realizing that if someone shows you how they view your place in their life, you're allowed to reconsider where they belong in yours. Today, I live in a home that represents my own choices, my own stability, and my own understanding of what partnership should look like. And that brings me to something I'd genuinely like to ask you. If you discovered that someone made a huge decision about your shared future without even telling you, would you try to repair the relationship? Or would you quietly start building a different future?
Cảm ơn bạn đã theo dõi. Hãy bấm đăng ký và bật chuông để luôn cập nhật nội dung mới.